This is Randall Root, and in this video we'll take a look at creating a cube in SSAS. So in the previous videos we have created 3 dimensions. We still have a few more to go, but at this point we can go ahead and create a cube. Now these 3 dimensions represent very common dimensions. I'll show some more advanced dimensions in the upcoming videos. But they're certainly good enough for us to go ahead and create a cube to review what we've created so far. I would recommend that before you go any further, you make sure that you can deploy and process the cube as it is, or excuse me, the dimensions as they are. And if they're successful at that point, it's a good time to go through and try making the cube. And making the cube is pretty easy. You just have to right click and say new cube on the cubes folder. Well, of course it launches a wizard, in which case you advance it and say that you'd like to base your cube on existing tables. Some other options exist, but they're not important for right now. On the next screen, you have to choose which of the tables contain your measures. Now they call these the measure group tables. I wish they would have given them a different name. They represent the tables that are your fact tables. So you can just go ahead and click on the links if you'd like fact sales and fact title authors. Actually, we're not using fact title authors, so I can remove that one. Or you can hit suggest. And most of the time it does a pretty good job at guessing which table is going to be their fact table. Now, one thing about a fact table is that the relationship lines will go away from the fact table from the dimensional keys. So like the title key goes away from the fact table to dim titles. The order key away from the fact table to dim dates. I'm so sorry, the order date key away to the dim dates, and the store key to dim stores, and so on. And the fact that the relationship lines are moving away from this one table is basically how the wizard guesses which ones are fact tables. In other words, there's no relationships coming into the table. Dim titles has one coming into it. Dim publishers has something coming in, a relationship coming into it with the arrow there. Dim stores, dim dates, and dim authors. But fact sales and fact title authors do not, and as such, when you hit suggest, it assumes that those are your fact tables. Now, we purposely haven't added on the dim authors dimension yet. We're going to, like I said, in a later video. But currently, that doesn't exist yet. So, the fact title authors is just not needed. It acts as a bridge table between the titles and authors. So I can uncheck that. The wizard does not know anything beyond what the relationship lines tell it. So you have to ultimately make the decision yourself. Now on the next screen, it will pick up the measures based on whether or not the columns are something that can be added together, such as a quantity or any numeric value, and whether or not they're considered dimensional keys. Because I have the dimensional keys identified here, the wizard has a pretty easy time of figuring out which one's the dimensions. The dimensions and which one's the measures. You can always, even if you don't have any actual measures in a fact table, it can always come up with a count of the number of rows under a given combination of dimension keys. So for an example, if I have an order ID of 1, a dimension date key of 500, and title key of 1, and store key of 1, and that same combination happens 3 times, the count is 3. So it can always come up with that, and the wizard will actually offer to make one of those for you. At this point, you can either choose to keep the new measure that it can generate for you, or remove it by unchecking the box. That's really up to you. Most of the time, keeping it is acceptable. You may want to change the name, such as in this case, it would represent like the order count or maybe sales count, depending on your naming convention. Advancing the wizard will allow you to identify which dimensions you've already created should be included. We've already made 3 here, and as such, it's going to guess we want those. That's correct. Now, if there are no relationship lines between the fact tables that we've chosen and the dimensions that we've already created, the wizard won't pick those up. So those relationship lines are important. For example, if there was no stores relationship line here, it would not pick up dim stores. So if this relationship line wasn't here, this checkbox wouldn't even be offered for us, even if the dimension was made. It sees that there is a relationship between fact sales and dim titles, but we haven't created the titles dimension yet. And as such, it's going to ask if we want to go ahead and create it for us. It also thinks that it's a snowflake, and it is, and offers to include dim publishers as a secondary table in that same dimension. Now, if we go ahead and leave the checkboxes here and just move on to the next part of the wizard, it will create a very rudimentary version of the dimension, at which point we can go and configure it later. And to kind of see that in future demos, I'll go ahead and leave that as it is and just say, sure, make it for me. And after that, you have the name of the cube, and at which point you go through and give it a name such as cube DW pub sales. I'm doing that because the other ones are called dim. It's just a silly naming convention I'm using at the moment. Now, it's a little disconcerting when you first see this because it looks very similar to the data source view. A couple of things you'd notice that there's no color coding in the data source view in 2012, although there is in the 2010 version of this software. And people, I guess because of that, would get confused at first that they're looking at the data source view. But what this is all the tables that have been included in the cube. For example, I did not include dim authors, and so it's here somewhere, but in the data source view, but not here in the cube version of it. Only the tables that have been currently added to the cube and are being used by the cube show up here. Dim titles, of course, has been added, and dim publishers along with it because of my earlier election to include it and have it create a dimension for me. And you can see on the Solution Explorer window that indeed the dim titles dimension has been created for me. It's not well organized yet, but it certainly is there. It's also gone through and created another dimension that it referred to as published date, and that is because of the secondary relation coming out through the titles table to to the dim dates table. Let's go to the second tab of the dimension editing window. This is the dimension usage tab. Here you can see a couple of things. You can see that the fact sales is our measure group table, and that the dimensions that we're working with are listed here, including dim dates, which happens to be listed twice. Once based on the order date attribute, and once based on the relationship between dim titles. There's an interesting icon here. This icon indicates that it's being considered a reference dimension, which is a type of dimension we'll talk about a little later. But what it is that you can reference the date table through dim titles. Now, that's maybe not be the relationship we really want at this point, but that's what the wizard came up with. Sometimes wizard gets everything right, and other times you kind of have to work with it a little bit. Now there's some other settings that we need to talk about going forward, such as these options up here and how you work with them. But for right now, I just want to see if this thing works. So I'm going to go ahead and use the second button on the toolbar. Notice that second button shows up on well, all these toolbars. It's the, click that first tab, it's the process button. And of course I can process from that toolbar button or from over here. It doesn't make any difference. But until I actually go through and process, I won't be able to browse the cube and see the results of what I've created. But once the processing is completed, I can certainly go over to the browser tab and take a look. Here's my order count measure, and here's my sales quantity measure. Here's my stores, so my stores attribute. And let's see, we had the order numbers. And the other one that we made, of course, was dim dates. Let's just take the year. So with these are the dimensions that we created by hand, and we configured them. Now let's look at the ones that were created by the wizard. First, let's look at dim titles. You can see that instead of the title name, we're just seeing the title key. That's alright, we know how to do that. We just go back and configure it to have a name column. And we can expect the publisher key to be the same. There are no additional user-defined hierarchies in there either, and we probably would want to have those, grouping titles under their publishers. If we look at the published date, we can see information about what year particular titles may have been published. Of course, currently, we're not seeing a whole lot. Oops, I got the year in there twice, didn't I? We're not seeing a whole lot of information about the title name, but that particular title should have been published on June of 1991, and we could go through and look to verify that that indeed was true, and maybe even contrast it with the sales date. So this is the order date. Now one issue that happens is that in this browser piece here, you can't necessarily tell whether or not a date is part of one dimension or the other unless you hover over it and look at it. But certainly doing that as long as the attribute names, like if I have year in here, I've got 2 years. If I had actually gone through and named the attributes order year and then published year, that might be a little bit easier to decipher instead of having to hover over them. Same is true of this one, which was published date. Let's filter it down a little bit. Up here in the dimension section, you can choose a particular dimension, or filter section. You can choose a particular dimension, identify the hierarchy, the operator, and I'll just go ahead and say I want just the first one. It seems somewhat suspicious to me that these are all on the same month, so I have to make sure I go back and verify that those published dates are correct. It should be relatively easy to do. Let's go look at the data source view. Right click on TIM titles and explore the data. First title is just cooking with computers. Published date key is 525. Okay, let's look at the dim dates. And we're looking for 525. June of 1991. Now, we should also look in the actual database to make sure that that is accurate as well. I can do that by using SQL Manager Studio and pointing to the original source data and verifying that that's accurate. It's always a good idea when you first make your cubes to go through and verify your data is correct before you move on. Let's see, that was cooking with computers was our first value, and it was published in June of 1991. Excellent, so that looks good. I don't think that's an exhaustive test. We would continue to work on that, testing our data a little bit more, but certainly that would be kind of the way of looking it over. Another thing you probably should do is you should open up and analyze the data in Excel. Now they've put a button here. The icon changes depending what version of Visual Studio you're using. This is the new stealthy icon, which looks a little small. It's a little harder to tell that it's Excel, but it's all right. If you click on that button, it will open Excel. And at that point, you can go through and see what it's going to look like using Excel. Now these are the published month and day. Which isn't very useful to us right now. Let's put in the title key as well. And actually, I think I want that one up above. My little report's not coming out so well. Let me work on this a little bit. Okay, here's our title key, which isn't much to look like, but now we have our published date, and I'll just take, under more fields, I'll just take only the published year and put it in here. And only the published month and put it in here. And then finally I'll get around to the orders date. And put that in here as well. Let's put in the year. Now this is the year it was sold. This is the year it was published, and as you can see, there's really no indication of that here. Um, you can often get a better view of the data by coming over and changing the display to classic pivot table layout, and sometimes that can be of use. We get anything better here? Not so much. Yeah, it looks like I need changes to publish month. Not sure we gained much in the classic layout on that particular occasion, but still. We can doctor this up for reports. And maybe come up with some interesting information about, how things sell related to when they're published. So it needs some more validation, of course, but the deal is we've actually got our cube, and we've looked at how to kind of test and see the data and review it. Now what we would need to do is start looking at some more ways of creating more advanced dimension settings, such as adding the many-to-many relationship in dim authors. Also, the the titles dimension is going to form multiple hierarchies. We'll take a look at the reference dimension in more details. But that's all coming up in some additional videos in the near future, and hopefully I'll see you back for there.